money. This is at the very heart of the paradigm shift that we have to have on this planet, is helping people to understand about money. And money is one form of information. That's all. It's not scarce. It was a brilliant invention. And if it's properly managed, it can be a store of value and a good medium of exchange. And I think that now we're at the point where so many people now see money being printed on TV. It's almost every day. We're now at the point where we can help people understand what money is and what it isn't. Well, I wrote a book in 1981 called The Politics of the Solar Age, and I had just come from 6 years at the U.S. Office of Technology Assessment, advising that government body about all of the technological choices that we had in our future. And it was clear to me that the mega choice we were all going to have to make was to shift from fossil-fueled early industrialism, which was already, 300 years old, to the technologies of what I call the solar age. And they are, of course, renewable energy technologies, maximum efficiency, recycling, and designing technologies to work with nature rather than destroying nature. So that's the shift, the great transition. And I think it's interesting to me that all the fights that are going on in the U.S. Senate and around the world on climate change and all of that, underneath the whole thing, it's the politics of the solar age. It's the tug of war between coal and oil and all of the other fossil fuel incumbent industries and the emerging industries and technologies of the solar age. So it's now seeing it happening. Well, I had been predicting the crash of the financial system for at least 15 years, and I've always referred to it as a global casino. And that's exactly what it is. And it really began to gather speed when President Ronald Reagan in this country and Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister in Britain, in the 1980s, they started deregulating everything, banks. And so that process, coupled with the rapid evolution of information technology, and of course all the other globe-girdling technologies that we had created, jet planes and satellites and all the rest of it, put that together with the market fundamentalism, which was the ideology of Reagan and Thatcher, and the whole process of globalization accelerated enormously. And there were these completely deregulated financial organizations and empowered to create all of these crazy new so-called financial innovations like credit default swaps and all of these other things, put that stew together. And I was writing articles in the 1990s saying this was a recipe for disaster. So the only thing that surprised me is that it took so long. Mostly the fact that the money systems, that global financial casino with all of these competing big banks and investment banks and all the rest of it, basically had decoupled from the real economy. And a good banking and monetary system is supposed to track and keep score of the actual transactions that are going on the ground in the real world, people making shoes and growing cabbages and interacting with each other. And what happened was very similar to what happened in 1929 before the great crash and depression at that time, was the pyramiding of paper assets and the creation of all of these fancy derivative instruments. And a derivative just means that it doesn't have, this piece of paper doesn't have any real value, but it's based on the value of something else that's real on the ground. And so what happened, and this was in spades in the crash of 2008, was that the financial instruments were pyramiding on top of each other to the point where the financial sectors, particularly in the United States and Britain, were about 25% of the country's GDP. In both countries. And in 2007, in the U.S., the profits from the financial sector, Wall Street and insurance and banking and all the rest of it, was 40% of all of the profits made that year. Now, an efficient financial system is like an electric utility. And it should be really run like a public utility. And any financial system that is using up more than 10% of a country's GDP is inherently out of control and kind of metastasizing and becoming a cancer on the real economy. And that's what happened, and that's what we still have in 2010. We still have a situation where the banks have captured the regulators in Washington, and they are setting themselves up for the next great crash, unless they're properly regulated and controlled. Yes, well, I've spent about 30 years of my life railing against this crazy scorecard of GNP and GDP, which was enshrined after World War II. See, it was used first during World War II to measure the production, the war production. And so it values bombs and bullets and tanks and all the rest of it very, very highly. It doesn't measure the value of the environment at all. That's carried at zero on the books. Healthy, productive human beings that are the real wealth of nations are valued at zero on the GDP account. So what you have really is just a very simple cash flow kind of accounting that's averaged up from all of the transactions between companies and businesses, all conducted in money. And the problem with that is that about 50% of all productive activity in any society, even advanced, so-called advanced economies like ours, is unpaid. And it's the activity of raising children, serving on the school board, growing vegetables, arranging for farmers markets, all of those kinds of things. And when you actually look at that half, the unofficial, what I call the love economy, and realize how vast it is, and the fact that it's completely ignored along with the environment, you see that a scorecard that bad is going to drive countries over the cliff, because it will simply not count for environmental destruction, not count for the disruption of communities when companies shut down and unemployment increases, all of those things. And so I first began to in earnest lobby about this. I went to the Earth Summit in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro, and there were a lot of NGOs from both urban justice organizations and environmental groups. And we managed to get a plank in what came out of that summit, which was called Agenda 21. And plank number 40, which was signed by 170 countries, promised that they would correct their GDP accounts and they would begin taking into account environmental costs and benefits and unpaid work and the gap between the rich and the poor, put an asset account that was so that you could carry on the books the valuable infrastructure that taxpayers were paying for, also not acknowledged in GDP. And so that was where my real activism on this began. And it's gone on through the years until 2007, when I helped the European Commission organize a conference called Beyond GDP. And we put that on in the European Parliament. The second time, we tried to do it 10 years earlier with really no traction at all. But this time, November 2007, we had 700 statisticians of quality of life and sustainability, of health and education, environment, together with all of the European members of Parliament. We had the galleries full. It was totally wonderful. And just a couple of years after that, the European Commission now has given a directive to the 27 nation members of the European Union to say, okay, correct your GDP. So I'm going to die a happy woman. Well, a more holistic and systemic scorecard, I decided I'd better do one. And so I got together with my friends at the Calvert Group of Socially Responsible Mutual Funds, and I've been on their advisory council since 1982 and only got off it in 2004. And so Calvert and I set up what we call the Calvert Henderson Quality of Life Indicators. And it took us a while, but we decided that the most important 12 aspects of quality of life would be what we would measure. And not that you couldn't have hundreds and hundreds of different indicators of quality of life. What we wanted to do was to crank them down to what we knew in public interest kind of polling that most people cared about, in elections, and they were education, health, human rights, environment, and we added ones that we knew were really important, like energy efficiency and infrastructure and recreation. We decided that that was a really important indicator. How do societies recreate their creativity and their energy? And so the Calvert Henderson Quality of Life Indicators were launched in the year 2000. And we have a big fat 2-inch manual showing where all the databases come from. And I update that every month. And of course, for some of the indicators, they don't have monthly data, like attendance at ballet and opera. Those kind of indicators don't change every month. We change that like once a year. But some of the indicators do change once a month. And if you go on calvert-henderson.com and click on current issues, you'll find my monthly overview and commentary about where I think the indicators game is going in the world. So it was basically done as a public education exercise. And we realized that what was wrong with the economic method used to compile the GDP is that they would average up all of these apples and oranges, and using only money coefficients would come up with this one insane number. And that was more confusing than anything else. And the problem was that journalists and editors just would grab that number when it came out from the Commerce Department and go, duh, okay, GDP went up or went down, without any comprehension. And so we said, no, the Calvert Henderson quality of life indicators are going to be unbundled so that everybody can see what those 12 indicators are. And so if you care about education, you can follow the education indicators, or health or environment or whatever. And basically, we were saying that you cannot manage a complex society with a single discipline like economics. It must be multidisciplinary, and it must use metrics that are appropriate. So, for example, with the environment, you don't use money to measure the environment. You have atmospheric chemists tell you how many parts per million of junk there is in the air, or the same with water supply. And you don't measure human rights by money. You don't measure health care by money. We're finally beginning to realize that throwing money at a broken healthcare system doesn't help the situation. It makes it worse. So most of our indicators do not use cash and economic measures at all, and we expressly don't use the economic method of weighting, which is the process where they bring all those apples and oranges together, and then they go in the back room and decide in a very normative process, not science at all, which is more important. And that's how we try to show an alternative to GDP. It all goes back to this idea that we are moving from the Cartesian approach to knowledge, which drove the early industrial revolution. And it was a brilliant method, slicing reality up into smaller and smaller pieces to try to understand each particular piece. But of course, what happened was a crisis of this kind of reductionism that we see happening every day around us now. And suddenly we realize knowledge is in silos and stovepipes in all of these various government agencies. And I'm encouraged that the new metaphor that everybody's using now is, let's connect the dots. And this is the shift back to a more holistic way of dealing with reality, a systems approach. And I have always used a systems approach all my life. And that could be because I never went to college. I was fortunate enough not to have my brain organized in that kind of reductionist way. And so I am basically an autodidact. And I know this is very, very unfashionable. And I ended up, with 3 honorary PhDs from very respected universities. But basically, I think every child begins with this holistic view of the world. And somehow our education systems have to honor that and understand that children explore the world based on their own curiosity, and somehow or other, to specialize too soon, created all those technological idiots that I used to encounter in the work I did at the U.S. Office of Technology Assessment, where they just couldn't put the thing back together. And I have been a friend of Fritjof Capra for many, many years. And it was, this is kind of a little bit of an aside, but I was reading Capra's book, The Tao of Physics, sitting in my office in Princeton back in the late 70s, I guess. And the phone rang, and the voice on the phone said, "This is Fritjof Capra." I almost dropped the book, And he said, I'm sitting here with Dr. E.F. Schumacher, who, has this book, Small is Beautiful. And I am asking him, who is an economist in the United States that I could work with, who knows the most about what's wrong with economics, to work with me on my next book, The Turning Point. And so he said, Dr. Schumacher's just told me that it's you. He said, oh, Hazel Henderson, of course. So that's how long I've known Fritjof. And we both have, over the years, really connected on the need for these systemic kind of solutions. In other words, when you change the scorecard, this is a systemic way of changing the game and steering processes in a new direction. So all of my work is about this kind of systems approach. And, I call myself a global acupuncturist, because what I'm trying to do is I'm always scanning all of this interacting globalization processes nested within a living biosphere. And I am always scanning to say, oh, is there an opening, a leverage point at somewhere in this system where if I have a finely crafted policy intervention needle that I can drop right in there, that it would reconfigure a system in a healthier way. And I reserve my energies just for those systemic intervention points, because you can't do everything. I think that from my experience as somebody who did not have a college degree and was your ordinary housewife and mother in the 1960s. And all I knew was that the air in New York City was very, very bad for my little kid. And so I started right there in the play park with the other mothers. And we organized a group in 1964 called Citizens for Clean Air. And we were learning as we went along. My Buddhist friends call it laying down a path in walking. And you have to have the courage of your own perceptions. And even though economists at that point in the city of New York were telling me, oh no, we couldn't afford to do anything that would clean the air. And I knew just instinctively that that wasn't true. And that I could see that the health effects of pollution, days lost with emphysema and all of that, had a cost that they weren't accounting for in their models. And that was why, and I know this was recounted in the publication that Fritjof and I did called Qualitative Growth. They recounted that back then by that time it was 1967, our new senator in New York was Senator Robert Kennedy. And our group contacted him, and he was going to be running for president. And we said, we will arrange a helicopter ride for you around the city of New York so we can show you the pollution, because the mayor had been telling me that it was mist rolling in from the sea. And so I thought, okay, well, we'll take Senator Kennedy around and we'll show him how it's actually coming from all these, chimney stacks everywhere. And a little bit after that, he gave his memorable speech at the University of Kansas, and he got it. We told him that we were concentrating on correcting the GDP, which didn't subtract the costs of pollution. We called them the bads, as did E.F. Schumacher. Let's subtract the bads from the goods and come up with a really net figure of whether we're going forward or backward. And so Kennedy picked up that whole thing brilliantly, and in that speech, and sent me a beautiful letter, which of course I have framed on the wall. So that's a very roundabout way of saying that people should begin where they are, with the part of the system they understand the best, and then find allies. And then after you've found allies in your local community, then reach out and try to make coalitions with other groups who may understand the problem a little bit differently, but you can find some way to work with them. And these methods of community organizing have been regularized, and President Obama learned them in Chicago at the same place that I learned them 30 years ago. And that is the great radical organizer Saul Alinsky wrote a book called The Rules for Radicals. And his ideas have really enabled a generation of community organizers to work in this way. So you don't have to start off as a PhD, and you do have to trust your own perceptions and your own experience, and then reach out to others. Well, money was a brilliant invention, and of course there is a healthy role for money. And basically, I believe that money should be operated responsibly at every level, from the village to the town to the national currency to the international currency. And there's no reason at all why you can't have decoupled money systems at every level, for different purposes, whether it's Berkshires in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, or many of the towns in Brazil who have their own currency. And so the problem with the global casino and the existing monetary system we have is that it's like what we would call in agriculture a very unhealthy monoculture, where you have not only this global monoculture directed from central banks and from the pinnacles of society, with no real understanding of what's going on the ground, and where you actually have a decoupling from what's happening on the ground. And this is, basically the source of the problem. Is the excessive level of abstraction. And the problem with that level of abstraction is that it's also made worse by mathematics and computer models that give you yet another level of abstraction where you think you can model, quote, risk. They have these models called value at risk and all of this. And so a healthy money system has to decentralize all of this. And the money has to correspond to the actual valuable productivity that's going on the ground, and relate very closely to the actual value of the natural resources that are being exchanged and used, and so basically what's very interesting today is that now that old global casino monoculture money driven from central banks has failed so dramatically, there's a huge opportunity now for us to redesign the system. And I'm very focused right now, and I'm sure I will be for a long time, in breaking the grip of that old global casino on legislatures like the U.S. Congress and the British Parliament and, the Japanese Diet and all the places where that global casino entrenched itself. So it's a big job, but certainly doable And the reason I'm very happy to see local currencies and local credit systems like Let's and time banking that my dear friend Edgar Kahn developed all those years ago. To see that happening at the local level not only helps draw the community together and match the unemployed people with the needs that need filling, but it also teaches people about money. And that money isn't scarce. We create money. We can have our own money. Teaches people about the role of interest, that the way banks created money with collecting interest isn't necessary. We can have interest-free money. And we can also use the advanced electronics that we have now, the information technologies, to create credit systems which don't even need printed money at all. And what I've been most interested in is the new pure information-based trading systems that are happening all over the internet, whether it's Craigslist or if you want a loan and the bank won't give it to you, you go to prosper.com, or if you're in Britain, you go to zopa.com, and you communicate with your neighbors and find somebody in your community to lend you the money. Like in this area in Florida, which is a farming area, there's a radio program, which is a money system. And farmers just call in on the radio and they say, okay, well, I need pepper seeds and I have 3 hours a day on my tractor available for the next 3 weeks. And then they get on and here's my phone number. And those are money systems. So people are beginning to understand that this is something that we all know how to do at the local level. This is the situation we all find ourselves in. We have one foot in the old money system, and yet we know it's not working, and we see our 401k going down every day, and yet we cannot quite believe that we're all going to have to get together and create the new thing, because that sounds so incredibly daunting, you know. And so we do have to be aware that we are living in this transition time, and that it is extremely schizophrenic, because we all know that if the main medium of exchange, however illusory it is, and however much it's losing its value every day, like the dollar is on the international markets, if we are going to communicate with the society we live in, we have to still use these dollars. And so I think that for individuals, the idea that you have to invest in your own skills and your own understanding of all of this is beginning to catch hold. People have felt for a long time, at least the people that I've worked with over the years in the environmental movement, they never expected the Social Security system to be in place by the time they would need it. I think that this kind of healthy skepticism of these big systems it has to happen. And I think that's the good part of the teabagger movement. Because I have always felt that if President Obama had realized the first thing he did when he came into office should have been to say, okay, job one is reforming the money system, reforming Wall Street, and the terrible unfairness of this society and the way that these bailouts have been dished out. And if he's a great communicator, and if he had gone on television and explained, well, you know, the old model was that we really thought that if you printed all that money and you poured it into the top of the big banks on Wall Street, it was supposed to trickle down to Main Street. And it's not happening. And we know now what they do with it. The Fed gives them all this free money and no interest rate, and they can't make much money lending to local businesses. That requires a lot of labor-intensive stuff, and much easier to simply do trading, just to go on the currency exchange markets and to play around with all of these financial instruments to invest offshore. And so if he had explained all of that, he would have had the biggest coalition from left to right that any politician has ever seen. Even bigger than FDR had when he came into office, because he would have had all the Ron Paul people who understood what was wrong with the Fed, all the way to the Dennis Kucinich people, and everybody in between, including the teabaggers. And the anger is justifiable anger at the hoax that we've all been, we've been participating, in a giant Ponzi scheme, basically. And so it's that difficult for people looking at that 401k. I know my daughter and her husband, they're dealing with that right now. They thought they had a college fund for my grandson, and it's not really there anymore. But somehow the faith in that system and all of the apparatus of Wall Street and watching whether the Dow Jones is going up or down, that whole culture has to be called into question, and that we are losing faith in that is a good thing, because then we begin to realize, okay, what do we have in our community? Well, we can do a farmer's market. We have a thriving farmer's market here. This is why the Schumacher Society has been so incredibly important, because they've shown people working models of how they can get together and do co-housing and local currencies and all of the ways that people can begin to create local safety nets. And I've been preaching this for 30 years, and I've always been ridiculed in many places at the World Bank. I'm the barter lady, or, that all of my ideas were like Schumacher's. I helped organize Schumacher's first lecture here in the U.S. with Bob Swan. And basically, we would be there at the Ford Foundation in the basement with 5 people, or a little group on Wall Street. And then it was only when the people began to understand his message that he began filling the Cow Palace in San Francisco. And that book became a huge bestseller. And so it's a very long roundabout way of saying that there's no substitute for people beginning to map their local community and getting together with their neighbors and specifically rejecting this economic model, which is all built on scarcity, competition, a hierarchy, and basically GDP growth-driven nonsense. And so the sooner people realize that we are now able in the information age, that there need be no scarcity in the information age, because if you give me information, I have it and you still have it. So everything, all of the intellectual models of the new economy are about cooperation, sharing, and abundance. And of course, we have all the energy we would ever need coming into this planet every day from the sun. So this is the reconceptualization, is that the 401k wasn't real abundance. and the abundance that we can all create together is of a completely different nature. Of course, it's very important right now and for the next few years to do a kind of politics which illustrates this to the politicians. We're having to teach the politicians now because they're in their bubbles, just like the Wall Streeters in their bubbles and the corporate people are in their bubbles. And what we have to teach them is, look, we know now that money isn't scarce. We see you printing it on TV. We know that it's just as easy for you to print $1 trillion so that every kid can go through college without having loans. We know that we can create a healthcare system that takes care of everybody and includes prevention. We know we can redesign our infrastructure for high-speed rail. We know we can invest in a renewable energy economy. So this should be the new politics, is not letting any politician ever get away with, well, where's the money coming from? We tell them, gotcha, you guys print it. We know you print it. So print it for what the public wants, not for what Wall Street wants. So that's the new politics, and, you know, it's going to be angry, and it has every right to be angry. Yes, absolutely. And of course, we still have all those people up top that keep telling us, well, the stock market's going up again. And if we don't reappoint Ben Bernanke, it will rattle the market. The market is a fiction. And it's nothing to do with the real world. And the sooner we withdraw our energy and attention from that, the healthier we get. And of course, you know, the insiders on Wall Street, I mean, they call it the pump and dump system. You see, where people go on CNBC and pump the stock, and then they dump it. As soon as, it's also called shearing the sheep on Wall Street. And that means that you get to, you know, you pump the stock, and isn't this wonderful, like Jim Cramer, you know, his program on CNBC, better get in that market or you're going to miss the next rise. And then when the time comes, they will sell into the market, and it's known as shearing the sheep. The sheep are all of us out there with our 401ks. I mean, you know, Bernie Madoff was only just a little part of it. And so basically, that's why I started a media company called Ethical Markets, because I'm not rejecting markets. And it is perfectly obvious from all of the anthropological studies I've read is that Adam Smith was right. People do have a propensity to barter. We love it, you know. And people have been getting together in market squares, in villages, and trading with each other ever since time began. And, you know, the cooler rings that were documented where people exchange shells and all of that. So nothing wrong with markets. But if you look at what makes markets fundamentally work, it is trust. That's the basis of it, that if you go and put your paycheck in the bank, that it will be there when you need to draw it out. And so when I started Ethical Markets, I wrote a little, you know, statement of mission, and I was saying that, you know, markets cannot go on existing in this kind of information age that we have without trust, and yet no economic textbook even looks at trust. It's got to have transparency. It's got to have fidelity of contractual agreements. You know, service. All of those things are the foundation pillars of markets, and we've gotten so far away from them that we have to recreate the kind of markets that people can trust. So at the time in 1982, when the Calvert Group began the socially responsible mutual fund, I was still working with Ralph Nader. And they came to me and said, would you be on our advisory council? For me, it was like, okay, I came from Britain, and during a time where it was a socialist country, as it still is today, at least in 2010, we don't know what will happen this year. And so I thought, well, I'm an American citizen, and this is a capitalist country, and I don't object to markets. And so how do we reform markets? That's the order of the day. And so the experiment which Calvert embarked on in 1982, there had been one or two earlier mutual funds. The Pax World Fund, I guess, was one of the first in the 70s, which put together a non-military kind of portfolio, which was successful. And so gradually the whole thing evolved, of course, to the hoots of derision from the Wall Street press. Oh, these people, these tree huggers, they're going to lose their shirts and all of this, And lo and behold, it went from about 40 billion, because there had been a lot of churches who had been using these kind of criteria for their portfolios. And it's now about, last time I looked, it was over 2 trillion just in the US alone with these kind of screens. And that's been a very, very important evolution. And I am deeply involved in that, actually, on a day-to-day basis. And mostly looking for small new companies coming up that deal with energy efficiency, with better storage batteries, solar energy, wind energy. There's a whole new sustainability sector, and it can be militantly profitable at some point, because these are going to be the new, IBMs and the new Microsofts. And so that's part of this transition that we're talking about. And that's what Ethical Markets is doing now with its green transition scoreboard, that we are watching the flood of private investments from people like me, who have a small portfolio and are willing to do the extra searching to find these kind of companies. You won't find them talked about by Wall Street people, because they're too small, they have their algorithms, and they're not going to really bother with this stuff. And so that's the evolution that's happening now. And of course, what is happening now is that Wall Street is paying attention. And so this makes the ethics of the whole thing even more interesting, because if you don't reform the way Wall Street operates, then all of the same irresponsibility can happen in investments in the sustainability sector. They can have exchange-traded funds, and they're already beginning to do this, which is says, okay, well, here's 20 solar energy stocks, and we'll have an exchange-traded fund, which is another form of derivative, and you can buy that. And so once again, you're getting further and further away from the real world. And so all of this will continue to happen, because these two parallel systems are interacting now more and more. The old Wall Street system sniffing around, knowing that there's some new game to be played here, but they don't understand, what does sustainability mean. And it was very interesting, the last time, I've known Al Gore for many years, and the last time I saw him in Puerto Rico, I think it was in 2003, and I was bringing a pilot of Ethical Markets to show people there. And so I talked to Gore, and we sort of had a great reconnect. And he looked at our a pilot and said, "Oh yeah, this is great." And he said, "Hazel," he said, "you only have to teach me about socially responsible investing." so I was saying to him, stick with media and get into socially responsible investing. Don't mess with politics anymore. It's terrible, and it's too corrupt. And so what's interesting about that was, of course, he joined up with David Blood from Goldman Sachs, and they set up in London this Generation Investment Bank. And from my perspective, the Goldman Sachs side of it has been holding him back, because they've been trying to keep the foot in the old system and sort of hedging, in ways that don't really allow Gore to be Gore. And yet there are people like my friend Matthew Kiernan, Canadian, who started the company called Innovest. And he's just launched a new fund yesterday at Davos. And he really knows how to do sustainable investing. So it's a matter now of having to have a great deal of perception of the promises, the business plans, the prospectuses, and of course, for me, what it is finding companies that have not gone public, and hopefully telling them, you don't need to go public. You don't need Wall Street. None of us need Wall Street anymore, or any of these financial centers, because their error was that they thought that they provided capital for us. They never provided capital. All they did was to take the savings of somebody who had done something productive and useful and find somebody else who could use it for some new enterprise. And that is a public utility function. Back to that whole idea that a good banking and financing system should be a public utility. And so that's where we are. We're in the middle right now of all of this incredible confusion. And the kind of companies that I find to invest in are ones which are very young, and of course they're risky, like, for example, a company called Envision Solar, which I like a great deal. It's a total no-brainer. They make solar umbrellas on parking lots all over the country. They're beginning to sell them already, where you'll be able to plug your hybrid car in and get it recharged while you're doing your shopping. And they've got contracts all over the country now, like with Best Buy and all these huge parking lots. And they don't need to go public because until Wall Street is reformed, it's like diving into shark-infested waters to have your beautiful little company go public on Wall Street, because then you're beholden to their sick, greedy value system. So I'm working with a company in Chicago now called Entrex, and what they do is that they have an index of private companies, small private companies, which actually outperform most of the ones that are traded on Wall Street. And they have designed a new way for those kind of companies to get the capital they need to grow without going to a bank and without going to a greedy venture capitalist who wants to take most of their equity. And so I'm working with Entrex, just in a voluntary basis. There's nothing official about it, or no monetary deal there. But it's just that those are the kind of innovations. You see, we can do electronic stock exchanges. Every town can have their own stock exchange, so that you bring together the local investors with the local business opportunities. So at every level of the system, these changes are going on, and they're not reported, as you know, in the mainstream media. So that's what makes me very hopeful, that we have everything in place to accelerate this transition. It's already happening, the technologies, the infrastructure, the new market models, all of that is happening. And probably it's better that it's happening under the radar of mainstream media. Of course, what everybody in the Obama administration and the Bush administration, the Bush administration was just totally stampeded into doing what they did in September of 2008. Because, if you have, the Treasury Secretary and the head of the central bank, there was the Bernanke and Henry Paulson coming in and telling, if you don't do this, the whole thing is going to fall apart. Probably they did have to do some of it. But the problem was that there were no strings attached to it. They just kind of, caved. And the Obama people came into this horrendous mess. And most of that bailout legislation was already in place. They did strengthen some of the provisions. But it should have been done better. And that was not the Obama people's fault. The die was already cast by the time they came in. In the case of bailing out General Motors and Chrysler should never have been bailed out. That was owned by a private equity firm, and that firm itself wouldn't put any more into Chrysler. They had plenty of money, and if they wouldn't do it, the idea that the taxpayers should do it was insane. And so my approach much more would have been to pay every worker as much of a guaranteed income as would be needed for them to retrain themselves. Far better to bail out the workers than to bail out the company. And it probably would have been better to do that too with General Motors. And, this, of course, is the whole paradigm problem, that everything has to be sort of trickled down, whereas the only approach that really is working is trickle up. If they had really taken much more of the TARP money and forced banks to renegotiate those principals in those mortgages, so that they would cut the principal down to the actual market value of the house. If we had said to the banks, you don't get the TARP money unless you renegotiate every one of these mortgages. And, you could have had other provisions in there that would say that people would be allowed to rent, stay in their home and rent it until, things... So there were all of those kinds of things. And the best actor in the play was a Republican, and that was Sheila Bair, who was heading up the FDIC. And she, in a very orderly way, closed, a lot of the banks. And she designed like a one-page thing that was sent out to people who had mortgages that were underwater, saying, if your mortgage is underwater, this is the new deal that we'll give you. We'll cut the principal, and just all you have to do is to sign this. And instead of that, you see, that was not taken up by most of the banking sector. They were fighting to keep those loans. And of course, there was the problem of securitization, that once a loan is sold on in a package, and the package is bought by a municipality in Norway, it's very, very difficult to unpack that individual mortgage. And my favorite member of Congress, Marcy Kaptur, who represents Toledo, Ohio, she said to all the people in her district, if they can't find your mortgage and produce it, then they can't throw you out of your house. And she was legally right. You know? But the anger at the bailouts, the bailouts which were done by the Fed were worse than the bailouts done by Obama and the Treasury. And the Recovery Act, the $780 billion in the Recovery Act, was pretty much okay. I would have liked to have seen a lot more of it go into solar energy and clean infrastructure and smart grid and all of that kind of thing. But given the fact that Republicans had to vote for it, they had to put in a lot of the things that Republicans like, you know, tax cuts and all of that. But the real problem is the Fed. And it's shocking that we have Bernanke now for another 4 years, because what he's doing is still giving free money to the banks every day with zero interest. So if you give free money to the banks, they go to the discount window and they get as much free money as they want. And you don't have an absolute command that is loaned out to local businesses, then they're going to go on sending it offshore. As these big money center banks on Wall Street take the free money from the Fed and ship it overseas in all these risky investments, they've collapsed the domestic money supply. Because if you have a system like we do, where the money supply is created 97% by bank loans, and there's no bank loans being made, and the securitization market has dropped dead, of course the domestic money supply is collapsing. And if the money supply collapses, of course you have a recession. And so it's totally unnecessary. The recession and all the foreclosures and the job losses, I mean, that's the thing that makes me really angry, is that it's unnecessary. In a way, we're all living through the end of an era, and we can see the beginnings of the new era all around us. And it's the end of the fossil-fueled early industrial era, with all of those technologies which were completely oblivious of their effect on natural systems, basically. And we're shifting into what I call the solar age. And this means that we really have to re-perceive everything. And so in a real sense, there's no shortage of money. That's the biggie. It's just a crisis of perception. We don't realize that we design money, and we humans designed all of these malfunctioning technologies, and that we have all of the technologies at hand, many have been suppressed for generations, to create a really harmonious a technology which respects the earth, and we can decentralize our economic systems and our political systems, that there can be much more participation at the local level. All of these things are at our fingertips, but we do have to take our attention off the mainstream mass media, off the usual political mainstream discussion, and perceive our own communities again as the source of building this new kind of society. So it's all absolutely doable, but we do have to take off those rose-colored spectacles, you know, that told us that President Obama was going to be able to handle things. As I've been telling my friends for a long time, and this is a really old one, is that we are the leaders that we have been waiting for. Well, we do have a list on ethicalmarkets.com. We have a page there called Community Development Solutions. And most people are really getting the point, whether it's getting together. It begins with neighborhood meetings, figuring out how your town is operating, what your local resources are. Where can you find the food you need within 100 miles of where you live? Finding the entrepreneurs, finding the local credit unions. I mean, I'm just in the process now with our company of taking our bank account and putting it in the nearest credit union. All of these things. Step-by-step things that people can do. And of course, healthy food is local. You get it from the farmer's market. Try to reduce the amount of meat you eat and go a little more toward vegetables, which is, much better for humans. All of the things that people can now do around their own homes, everything from changing the light bulbs to turning down the power, the heating and the air conditioning, victory gardens. There's just so much people can do. And of course, back to our theme, is supporting ethical businesses, fair trade, and doing local currencies, local time banking. I think the time banking is particularly important because it can be done, totally like whether it's in an apartment building or on a street, find out who your neighbors are. All of the things that we used to use money for. Money was a way it was a way of disintermediating from your neighbors, And we got to rely on money to solve our conflicts. You hire a lawyer and all of that kind of thing. And then there's co-counseling, so that you don't necessarily have to hire a psychologist to help you. You can go to your neighbors or get together in a group and do group therapy on each other. It's all to do with rebinding local communities and understanding that globalization is not going to go away, because I believe that human beings will be a global species, because this is in our DNA, really. We've been evolving for millions of years, and we're not going to stop now. But it does mean that we have to integrate our local community appropriately with the national government. And I like to use the metaphor of cells. And every cell in our body has a membrane around it, but it's a semi-permeable membrane. And that's what local cultures are about. Deciding what trade they want to do with the outside world, what they want to let in, what they want to keep out, and what they want to preserve about their local culture, and what they love about the broader culture. And I've always said that world trade is really going to be in shipping around recipes, not cakes and cookies. In other words, you don't need to have ships full of cars crossing each other in the Pacific. That's not world trade, that's just pure entropy. Most local areas can produce most of the stuff they need. And what needs to be in world trade is really the ideas, the recipes, valuing each other's food and art and music and culture. It's going to be a shift from hardware to software. And I welcome that kind of world trade with new rules, which protect the environment and protect human rights. All of that, we know how to do all of these things. And so we have a big redesign job. It's like a design revolution from top to bottom. And that ought to be fun because everybody can be involved.